For decades, the world followed one rule: build wherever labor is cheapest, ship everything everywhere, optimize relentlessly for efficiency. And for a while, it worked. Factories moved across oceans, supply chains stretched across continents, entire economies became dependent on industrial networks that no longer controlled. But something changed. Now governments are scrambling to bring industry back home. Steel is suddenly a national security issue. Energy infrastructure is becoming geopolitical strategy. Factories are being treated less like businesses and more like strategic assets. Because the world is realizing something uncomfortable. A nation that cannot build eventually becomes vulnerable. And quietly, beneath headlines about inflation, AI, and geopolitics, a new industrial order is emerging. The old system was built on one obsession: efficiency. For nearly 30 years, globalization rewarded companies that could produce faster and cheaper than everyone else. Manufacturing moved wherever labor costs were lowest. Supply chains became deeply interconnected. Western economies outsourced industrial capacity while focusing on software, finance, and services. The logic was simple: why build steel domestically if another country can make it cheaper? Why manufacture components locally when global shipping is inexpensive? Why maintain industrial redundancy when just in time systems maximize profits? Efficiency became religion, and globalization became infrastructure. China became the factory of the world. Europe specialized. America optimized consumption and technology. Industrial production fragmented across borders. The system looked unstoppable until the world became unstable. The first cracks appeared in supply chains. Pandemic shut down ports. War disrupted energy markets. Shipping lanes became vulnerable, and critical components suddenly became unavailable. Entire industries realized they had optimized themselves into fragility. They came Then came the second shock: geopolitical return. Trade was no longer just trade. Factories were no longer just factories. Steel meant infrastructure resilience. Semiconductors meant military advantage, and energy systems meant national stability. Governments began asking questions they hadn't asked in decades. What happens if critical supply chains fail? What happens if industrial dependence became geopolitical leverage? What happens if another country controls the materials your economy cannot survive without? And suddenly, manufacturing stopped being a background industry, it became strategic. In the United Kingdom, the government announced plans to nationalize British steel. That decision is bigger than one company. It represents something deeper. Governments are beginning to treat industrial capacity as too important to leave entirely to market forces. Because steel is not just another commodity. Steel builds rail systems, energy infrastructures, defense systems, factories, cities. When domestic steel production weakens, national resilience weakens with it. And nearly the same time, pressure intensified for the UK to secure urgent steel trade arrangements with the European Union, not because steel suddenly became fashionable, but because industrial dependence has become dangerous. The old world assumed global supply chains would always remain stable. The new world assumes disruption is inevitable. That changes everything. Even political messaging has shifted. The King's speech in the UK placed manufacturing, energy security, and industrial growth near the center of national economic strategy. That would have sounded unusual a decade ago. Now it sounds necessary because countries are beginning to understand that economic power without industrial capability is fragile power. And this shift is not limited to Britain. Across advanced economies, governments are rebuilding industrial strategy around resilience instead of pure efficiency. In the United States, clean energy manufacturing jobs are rising rapidly as industrial policy accelerates domestic production. Factories are returning not simply because labor is cheap, but because strategic control matters more. At the same time, aerospace giant Boeing announced massive investments into American manufacturing facilities and workforce development. This is not nostalgia for old industry. It is preparation for industrial competition because the next era of manufacturing will not be driven by cheap labor alone. It will be driven by automation, robotics, energy systems, AI optimization, and industrial intelligence. And the countries that master those systems will dominate supply chains that the world cannot function without. That is why discussions around sovereign manufacturing are becoming increasingly serious. The phrase sounds political, but underneath it is brutal economic reality. No nation wants to depend entirely on geopolitical rivals for critical infrastructure, not for steel, not for energy, and not for advanced manufacturing, and neither for industrial technology. The age of hyper efficiency is colliding with the age of geopolitical uncertainty, and resilience is becoming one more valuable than cost minimization. This is not a temporary correction. It is the early architecture of a new industrial era. Factories themselves are evolving. The industrial winners of the future may not be the countries with the cheapest labor, but the countries with the smartest industrial systems. AI driven manufacturing, autonomous logistics, energy efficient production, robotic labor, digitally coordinated supply chains. The factory is transforming from a physical building into an intelligent strategic network that changes labor. Some repetitive industrial jobs will disappear, others will become highly technical. Industrial work increasingly merges with software, robotics, and system engineering. At the same time, governments are realizing something uncomfortable. If they lose manufacturing capability, they lose strategic independence. A country that cannot build semiconductors became dependent. A country that cannot produce energy infrastructure became vulnerable. A country that cannot secure industrial supply chains eventually loses leverage. This is why industrial policy is returning globally, not as ideology, as survival strategy. The next economic superpowers may not simply be the countries with the best apps, but the countries capable of controlling physical production in an unstable world. And that creates a new divide between nations that build and the nations that merely consume. For years, manufacturing was treated like an old industry, something secondary, something replaceable, something that could always be outsourced. But history may be turning in the opposite direction.